A few days ago, I was a panelist in an academic forum sponsored by De La Salle University, and one of my fellow panel speakers was an interesting Filipino Protestant theologian whose name is Dr. Revelation. Well, his first name is Revelation, and nicknamed Reeve Velunta, who calls his method of biblical interpretation reading inside a jeepney. You know, Dr. Velunta takes his inspiration from the historical trivia about the American jeepney that used to serve as a carrier for the more primitive rocket-propelled bomb launchers during the World War II. And he notes how this military jeep has been transformed after the war by Filipinos from an instrument of mass destruction to a vehicle for mass transportation. Not only does this repurposed vehicle transport people, it also encourages conversation among them, because instead of the usual bus setup where the passengers are usually seated in rows facing the road ahead, inside the jeepney, the passengers face one another. Dr. Velunta calls it a perfect analogy for the biblical end-time image of a peaceable kingdom where people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Papandayin ng mga tao ang kanilang espada at gagawing pang-asarol. He says, we have done exactly the same thing with bombs and mortar shells, which have been transformed into church bells in many chapels built after the war. I am a witness to that dahil marami kaming mga kapilya sa Pampanga na yung church bells nila ay recycled na bomba nung giyerang Hapon. From weapons that kill people, they have been recycled into makeshift bells to call people to worship together. Nung ma-recycle, naging totally the opposite ang purpose. I found this method particularly fascinating, especially when he switched from the jeepney to the sacred scriptures. And he noted how words can be used also as weapons of destruction. Alam natin yan. Kahit ang salita pwedeng gamitin as weapon of destruction. He mentions, for example, how the story about the liberation of the oppressed slaves in the book of Exodus quickly turns into a story of conquest, occupation, domination by the time you get to the book of Joshua. To be consistent with the narrative of liberation and the upholding of human dignity, he reads the biblical story of the Israelite conquest or occupation of Canaan from the perspective of the occupied Canaanites by asking critical questions like this. What did the people of Canaan do to deserve to be mercilessly massacred or driven away from their country by these Israelites? Sa totoo lang, pag binabasa ko yung Biblia and I read about this, kinikilabutan talaga ako. I just cannot stomach it, and I cannot say, I won't believe in a God who orders the massacre of a lot of innocent people. Today's gospel is a perfect passage for Dr. Velunta's method of reading, as employed by Jesus himself, who is rereading and reinterpreting Psalm 110. In the gospel, I have a feeling, that Jesus is actually poking fun on the Jewish idea of the Messiah as a militant son of David, whom Yahweh their God promises to sit on his right hand in order to put his enemies at his footstool. That psalm that Jesus is quoting is very violent. It extols the God who, through his messianic hero figure, raised from David's family, let me quote directly, he crushes kings, heaps up corpses, and crushes their heads. And then after that, he holds his head high and drinks from a brook at the wayside. Nakakilabot. I imagine how the modern Zionist Israelis would read a passage like this, and how it would add religious fervor to their already aggressive and violent militancy and their triumphalistic faith in a God who tells them to conquer, to occupy territories, and to destroy the people whom they consider as enemies. Like I said, Jesus is making fun of the scribes' reading of the psalm. And he says, if the Messiah is a son of David, how come David, who is supposed to be the author of the psalm, is calling him my Lord instead of my son? And he turns the tables on them and suggests a non-militant Messiah, the Son of God, whose enemies are not human beings, but the spiritual rulers of this world, and who speaks rather not of a literal battle, but a spiritual warfare. Sometimes, I think, like Tobit of our first reading, we also need to be visited by an angel so that our eyes, which are very often blinded by the quest for power, can be healed and allowed to see the world again as God would have us see it. Then, perhaps we can also do a rereading of Scripture inside a jeepney.